Hi there, my name is Tom, or Dr. Thomas Dale McLean, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Beacon Academy. This piece of work follows on from the development of the Beacon internships, which were founded at the University of Warwick in the medical school there. Today we're going to be looking at the workshop on how to write an abstract. Now, what I would recommend to start off with is having a pen and paper ready, and as we go through, I'll encourage you to pause this recording and review what you know on a topic before we progress onwards. And that's just to help consolidate your thoughts around abstracts. So, let's get started. What we'll cover today is what an abstract is and why they're important. We'll also consider what an abstract looks like, what makes a good and a bad abstract, how to plan abstracts when you have data, again how to plan abstracts but this time when you do not have data, and then finally I'll give you some top tips that I've accrued from doing this session throughout and also looking at publications available online. So what I would like you to do now is to consider what abstracts actually are and why are they important. Now, this importance could be for a scientific community, a clinical community, or a lay person or lay individual. What I'd like you to do is stop this recording at the moment, give it a pause, and write down your thoughts both on what are abstracts and why they are important. Okay, so what are abstracts? These are scientific elevator pitches which provide insight into your work. So you could be writing a publication, you could be doing an oral presentation or a poster presentation at a conference, and what you need to do is before the conference you need to encourage your audience to get involved with the work. So for example, if you put down that you have done a piece of work and that's about it, people might not want to come to attend your talk because they don't know what it means to them. But if you can do a short overview of what your work actually is and why we should care about it, then that's more likely going to encourage people to come and view your work and actually engage with you and your work directly. When you're doing abstracts, try to be as unapologetic and unreserved as you realistically can about the work, and make sure that you're trying to tell them information that's clear to them and relevant for them. So you wouldn't want to talk about something completely irrelevant at a medical conference because the clinicians are very used to refining what they spend their time on. So if it's not relevant to them, they might disengage with the work without understanding actually it may have relevance to them. It's just the way that it's been communicated. If we then look at the structure of an abstract, for some people who are probably unfamiliar, these can all change. So I've given 3 examples here, which I've collected from 2023, is when they've been most accurate from. So BMJ Open, you can see, is a structured abstract. It's 300 words, and it gives you very clear headlines for what you should be writing in your abstract: objective, design setting, participants, interventions, and so on. The Annals of Surgery give you an example of a structured abstract with 1 or 2 sentences for an objective, a summary, methods, results, and conclusions. However, you'll notice above there's also the mini abstracts, which does not give you a suggested structure to be using. And the British Journal of Sports Medicine uses a structured abstract of 250 words and gives you vague headings of objective, methods, results, and conclusions. In terms of why abstracts are important, I've got a publication here on this link called Writing the Title and Abstract for Research Paper. Now, this is a publication which explains the importance of not just the abstract but also a title when you're doing a piece of work, which could be considered as any part of scientific communications. One thing to consider is that the abstract and title is probably one of the first things that are available to someone. So this is your your point of sale, if you like, of your piece of work. You need to make sure it represents the quality of the work that you've been doing, as well as making sure that it's relevant to the population that you're presenting to. When you come to look for research, if you are doing it on a personal laptop or on a phone or something along those lines, you often do a search and will find research papers and are able to look at an abstract and a title before needing to go through a paywall or some degree of institutional access to that journal. So it's important you get that information right to encourage people to then further engage with you. Systematic reviews also use abstracts as part of inclusion and exclusion criteria as they whittle through. And the key thing about publication or performing any degree of publication, whether that's written or whether that's oral presentation, is you want the people to actually start engaging with your work and use it, because there's no point doing anything if it's not going to have any value. So make it accessible so that systematic reviews can identify that it is a publication they would be interested in when reviewing that field. You want to also draw the reader in, so you don't want someone to look at the, at their phone just passively scrolling through. You want them to actually start looking at your work a little bit deeper to understand the complexities of what you've done in terms of your methods, look at your statistical analysis, look at your data points, and see your conclusions that you've come to at the end. And you want to look at the quality of these abstracts, because it will often be that the quality of the abstract is actually similar to the quality of work behind the text. So if you have a very, very comprehensive abstract, it's more likely that people will trust the results of your publication or attend and rely on the results that you're presenting to them in comparison to those who have not provided a good quality abstract. So let's cover what an abstract looks like. We've covered previously what structures may be present or may not be present. Abstracts can be divided into two components, both the structure and the content. A structured abstract looks at an IMRD, or an Introduction, Methods, Results and Conclusion. You may have additional structured components in there, as we've seen previously with BMJ Open, where they request a few other headings in there. These are a little bit harder in terms of getting the word count right, however they are easier to produce because you have a structure to work within. An unstructured one is a free-flowing, no-heading work, and I've put down that it's often not original research, but what I mean by original research is that this is a qualitative or quantitative structure of work that you've done. And it's often that is used in a structured abstract. Unstructured, you more look at things like literature reviews, which don't necessarily have a significant methodological process as part of that work. Content, it can be informative or descriptive. So informative ones we've seen are 250 to 350 words, and they provide a detailed summary with key results. When it's descriptive, it's often shorter at 150 words approximately, and that provides contents of the work, but it doesn't give you a significant volume of data. So it might say that this work, the work enclosed provides evidence towards something, or something along those lines. And often you'll see in scientific abstracts that actually you come across structured and informative abstracts more than anything else. So, if we move on and look at what abstracts are, what I'd like you to do is pause and consider what type of abstract this is. So, if you have got it right, well done. This is a structured and informative abstract. And we'll be coming to look at this abstract a little bit later. I have another example for you. Here, I'd like you to have a little look through this and see whether you can tell if this is a structured or unstructured, informative or descriptive abstract. And this is actually an unstructured, however, follows a very structured pattern, and you'll see that throughout, and I'll come to that in a second. And it's informative, so it's an unstructured informative. Now, you could consider it as a semi-structured. It doesn't have any headings. However, looking through the text, you have a background talking about social isolation. You have methods looking at formalising a service to facilitate regular virtual visiting. You have results looking at preliminary evaluations. And then finally, you have information about given ongoing physical activity restrictions, there's a need to develop services, which could be considered a conclusion. So that is why I kind of refer to this as a semi-structured and informative abstract. So what makes a good abstract and what makes a bad abstract? What I'd like you to do is on a piece of paper, make 2 columns, one good and one bad, and pause this recording and review what you think makes a good abstract and what makes a bad abstract, based on what you've seen so far. Let's go through a couple of abstracts and see if we like or dislike parts of what's coming up. So you'll have seen this abstract a little bit earlier. Let's go through it together. So we can see from the very offset that this is a structured abstract and it looks informative. And I can say that based on overview glance of the results. So to start off with, looking at the introduction, it's expanded what a longitudinal virtual patient is before then abbreviating it to LVP, which is a positive. Abbreviations, if they're not expanded beforehand, you won't understand what this is, and then it becomes quite complex. And if you're using a significant number of abbreviations in your abstract, again, it can be very difficult to go through and to understand. Now, one of the things that some people might be picking up on is that it talks about virtual patients, but it doesn't necessarily explain what that might look like. So to emulate general practice, allowing multiple encounters with a single patient, a new longitudinal virtual patient was developed. It doesn't give you what this longitudinal virtual patient actually is. Is this text-based? Is this an actual patient that's calling you online? Or is this something that's been recorded in advance? So it doesn't give you an actual indication of that. Now, that is a negative for some people. For some people, they might want to actually look into the publication further to see actually, is this of any value to me as an educator? Or they might want to look a little bit more to see what types of virtual patients exist in the world. Looking at the methods, it was integrated into a second year graduate entry medical school. It tells you the date of that, which is good. Students were asked about their prior experiences and expectations before they engaged with 2 consultations and 1 results session. So students are asked about 3 different sessions that they were engaged with. So we don't have a lot of data already. We don't have a lot of exposure for all these students. And data were collected from this survey and from the engagement with the longitudinal virtual patient. So it does look like they have a small data set. However, they're looking for the engagement of people over that activity, and they haven't specified what that engagement may look like yet. And they're also looking to see whether or not students are actually going to find it useful. It says feedback was collected and thematically grouped, so it looks like a qualitative study looking at themes from feedback. In terms of the results, survey responses indicated 1.7% or 2 out of 120. So we know 120 people who filled in the survey have filled in the survey, and 2 of those have had previous experiences with virtual patients. The majority expected longitudinal virtual patients to make a difference to their clinical reasoning. So you can see here that people are optimistic about that, but there are no data backing that up. I don't know how many out of 120 are actually thinking it will make a difference to their clinical reasoning. So there's a bit of data missing there. Out of 142 students engaging with the longitudinal virtual patient, so as opposed to the 120 that was surveyed, 142 engaged with the study, or with the longitudinal virtual patient, over half completed 75% of the work, which tells us that people are engaging with the work. But it doesn't say whether it was a mandatory requirement for students to engage with this piece of work. It doesn't tell you if this voluntarily completed the work. And informal feedback arose around accessibility, professional learning and development, and engagement with the module. So we don't actually know what this informal feedback would actually look like, whether this is a positive around accessibility or a negative around accessibility, for example. The data indicate longitudinal virtual patients are agreeable to students with good engagement and positive reports of clinical learning. Well, you don't necessarily know it's positive just yet because you don't have the data to back that up in the results. It's ambiguous. And then future work. Pet peeve of mine is I don't like seeing things like future works are needed. I prefer things to be very specific, and you can see here actually future work exploring reasons of engagement or lack of. So it looks at a key area, so it's suggesting that works are needed in terms of qualitative analysis for engagement or lack of engagement to longitudinal virtual patients. So it's good that it does specify what the future work should be, and it doesn't just give you a very blanket statement which is a fallback of saying future work is needed to better understand. Let's look at this publication or this abstract now. So take a moment to pause, go through it on your own, and then we'll come back to it in a second. So this talks about simulated patients being used as a method of teaching breaking bad news in medical education. You can see here that this is a very structured abstract, and it looks slightly informative, maybe a little less so than previously, just because there's a little less data held in the results section. Sometimes quite difficult to do for systematic reviews, which this is. You can see it's using 14 databases, and it tells you what the search terms were, which is good because you know how that work has been undertaken. In an abstract, it's very difficult to get the word count to say what the 14 databases are, so give them a bit of leeway for that. Data was systematically extracted and thematic analysis undertaken. It doesn't tell you who collected the data, how they were extracted, how did they make sure that it was fair, what quality assurances they used. That is something that is typically found in a publication anyway, so again, let them off for that. It tells you the number of articles screened, the number who met an inclusion criteria, and going from there, it gives information around different simulated patient models. So that's actually very useful to have as an overview. It says that simulated patients are uniformly reported as having a positive impact. We know that that's very useful. However, there's a lack of quality evidence comparing different forms of training. So it shows that there is a gap in the research clearly around a quality amount of evidence looking at differing training forms. There was some evidence that virtual simulated patients are as useful as in person. It would be useful to know a little bit more about that. So we're missing a tiny bit of information, but again, you don't know whether this is put in place because it's too much for a word count, or they don't have a necessarily large amount of data for this, or that they're trying to entice the reader in to go and look at what evidence exists around virtual patients. The conclusion is that simulated patients allow students to practice the communication skills without risk, detriment, patient care. We've not seen that just yet because there's no evidence in above that states that, but that's okay. Maybe that's something that's in the publication. Despite the heterogeneity of ways which they've been used, the benefits of different approaches and when and how they should be delivered remains unclear. So it tells you where the gaps are in the literature, which is a very useful thing for a systematic review to do, as it highlights where areas of research should be going forwards. Now, practice implications advise further development and research around simulated patients around the area of supporting undergraduate breaking bad news skills development. And I've kept the keywords here just as a bit of a heads up for some people who are looking at submitting pieces of work. These mesh terms or keywords are used to advise people on how to find access to their publication. So if you are looking at medical education in its entirety, this is a publication that you will come into contact with. Or if you're looking at a systematic review, again, this tells you a very clean way that there is a review which is systematic, which you should be able to see down here, and that is a way that you might be able to review some of this work or get access to this through a search function. I think we've got one last one. So this looks at frailty in a population. It's a structured abstract, and it looks again informative, maybe more so than the last one. So have a pause, let me know what you think. So this looks like more word count than we've been allowed previously. It talks about large populations are now looking at frailty across all age groups, and it tells you a bit more about the background, so we're quite happy with that. We know it's a prospective cohort study, and that gives a good indication of what it is and what biases a study may have, and it gives it a flavour of how someone might be overcoming any of the biases that they may perceive as part of their piece of work and how it's designed. We're looking at 200 patients. We've got a mean and a range of their ages. Now it looks at the prevalence of their conditions, and you've got ranges here of what a pre-frail or a frail state is. It doesn't define what frailty is, and it doesn't define what pre-frailty is, so it's a bit harder to understand if you don't know what those terms are already. Looking at the agreement between the instruments, they've used a kappa statistic, which is a universally accepted method of looking for agreement, and it's useful to see a kappa score. However, sometimes a kappa score is also associated with a p-value, and there is no p-value there available. Again, moving down, only the frailty phenotype was significantly associated with adverse outcomes. It's not talked about different tools that they have used, so we're missing a little bit of information previously. It's a bit of a surprise that they've used a tool, for example, because it's not been introduced. And then they use RR, which refers to a risk ratio, but again, if you're not familiar with looking at these, then you may not necessarily understand that that's what it refers to. And then in the brackets, we have an odds ratio of 1.5 to 2.45, but it doesn't tell you any confidence intervals. Again, something that might be useful going forwards is making sure you expand this as a risk ratio. Confidence intervals set at 95% are 1.5 to 24.5. I won't go too far into any more analysis on that. However, it's something to bear in mind that when you come to present your results, make sure that the results are accessible. So if anyone didn't understand that, think what it might be like when you're standing and looking at this publication completely separate to everyone else and not having anyone talk you through it. If it's inaccessible to you, then it should be improved. We're looking at 3 different scoring systems, so it compares them, and that's quite interesting to know, and it talks about how accurate they are. Finally, we move on to the conclusion, and it gives you our data do not support the current use of frailty scoring instruments, so it tells you what it isn't doing. And normally in science we like to say things that should go forwards, and we find it very challenging to publish anything that's a negative result. Here, it's very clear they are owning a negative result, and that's a very useful thing to see. There's poor agreement between the 3 established tools. That's important to know because if you're going to be measuring a length, you might be using a metre, a yard, or an inch, and this is a very similar thing that they're suggesting here between 3 established scoring systems. So that's useful to know clinically. However, the prevalence of pre-frailty and frailty across all age groups and adult surgical population identifies further research to refine scoring in surgical patients. So it gives you a way forward, doesn't just give you a bleak outlook. So that's quite useful. So hopefully you have found that useful, going through those abstracts and trying to piece together what you liked and what you didn't like. So go through your results and see what we've talked about just around what makes a good and a bad abstract. So good abstracts are often punchy, structured, they expand abbreviations, they don't have mistakes ideally, their results are accessible to those who are reading it who may not necessarily be overly well trained in statistics. And if people aren't well trained, it needs to be to some degree accessible, where if you've used complex statistical analyses, you at least explain the results of those in the results section or the conclusion section. Some things that we don't like, we've talked about abbreviations and things such as those, but also I think there's missing gaps in some of the information. Some data points might be more necessary than others, and if they're missed, then it just gives you that raised question of whether or not the abstract of any reasonable quality, or what else is being missed from the presentation on the abstract. Some people do use methods like that to encourage people to read the wider material, whether that's a poster or oral presentation or a publication in itself, but it's just to be mindful. Some things may be missing, some reasoning might be there for that. So let's move on to the process I tend to follow when it comes to abstracts. So I would initially go to wherever I'm submitting this abstract to first. So if I know a conference is coming up, I will go to the conference website and I will find the guidelines for authors. Or if you're doing a publication, it's author submission guidelines that you'd be looking for. Take the structure that they present to you, whether it is just introduction, methods, results, and discussion, or whether they also want things like it's a cohort study, we've received ethical approval from this department. If they want that in the abstract, make sure that's clearly defined on a blank document and have it separate to the work that you're doing. It's very useful to use a fresh new Word paragraph or Word page to or document even on your computer to ensure that you are not carrying the cognitive burden of all of the text that you've prepared previously. Don't forget as well, there is a word count typically associated with these things. Make sure it's the first thing you put on your list below the title so that you can keep checking back to your word count and make sure that you're not going over too much. Don't be afraid to go over right now, but just prepare your document ready. Then, looking away from everything, turn away from your computer. Tell me exactly what you did, why you did it, and what you know now. So, if you did any of that frailty project work, then it is, why did you do it? Because we have an aging population. What did you do? We assessed 3 different frailty tools and compared how they agreed with each other. What do I know now? They don't agree with each other, and therefore they're not synonymous. You can't interchange one with another, which may be useful going forward for clinical practice, because what someone is defining as frailty might not necessarily be truly a frail individual. That's an example. When you have these points and you verbalise them aloud, take these points and put them into your document. In the introduction, we have a frail population that's under-identified. Okay, method. We then compared 3 of these individual tests that were available, so on and so on. The 4th step is to check your abstract again against the guidelines and then look for mistakes. So your guidelines will be talking about your word count, things like that, and you're likely to be over initially. Look for abbreviations. For example, our longitudinal virtual patient, our LVP. If you have a significant number of abbreviations, try and work out how to whittle them down to what's necessary. Some people, when they're doing abstracts, might copy and paste areas of their pieces of work, and they may have references to things such as figures. Make sure you remove those because it should be a standalone item. Again, references are not suitable for abstracts, so make sure you remove those. Double check your data. So if you have percentages out of 100, they need to make sure that they add up. So if you have 4 items and they're 25, 25, 25 and 25%, but instead you've said that one's 26%, then overall you have something that is 101%, which will make people question the results of that work, but also the quality of the overall work. And then finally double check for any spelling mistakes, because our science words are very difficult at the best of times, and when there are mistakes as part of that project, it makes it harder to engage with, And people fixate on mistakes, and it reflects the quality of the work that you've done. The fifth step is to edit the words that you've put on the page to work out if you're in the word count and whittle it down to whatever you can get it to. If you're slightly over as well, don't worry, because your next step might help you there. There are ways of getting around word counts in terms of editing to really refine things. So I will keep adding the word "and" into a word count, and then it's useful to go through, and every time I search for the word "and," I look to see whether that word is needed or if the sentence can be restructured without it. And I typically do this line by line or sentence by sentence to see if I can refine each sentence so it still makes sense, but it's a reduced word count saying the exact same message. And then finally share it both inside the research team that you're working within, if you are working with one, and externally to someone who may not necessarily know your area of research, and get their feedback on what you've done. This piece of work also is very similar if you have no data. So if you have no data, you can still write abstracts. Just make sure that the key messages are incredibly clear. Right at the start I said the key to an abstract is to ensure that you're saying the right messages. Why do I care? And it's that key message that brings me in. I've mentioned before about how useful results are. Never ever fabricate them. There are people who will be reviewing your work who will be able to work backwards from a p-value to your original data set, which means that they can work out whether or not any of the results are fabricated. And that's incredible, and I admire their ability to do that. It is very useful to be able to do that, and it's unfortunate if anyone gets caught out, because it is scientific misconduct and your work will be stricken from the record and you will have a very tarnished relationship with any publications in future. It is a very serious problem. Another thing is, if you were to fabricate your results and someone thinks of it to change practice, then people are doing what you recommend on false results, so it can impact the lives of others. So just be mindful, a small misplaced on purpose decimal point might unfortunately change someone's life. It has a very big butterfly effect. When it's a work in progress, focus more around methodology. Make it very interesting about what you have planned to do and why does that method that you're taking matter. Why is it interesting? If it's different, if it looks at a different approach, use that. And make sure it doesn't put you off. If you're an early career researcher, if you're new to the area of research, don't let not having data put you off. Try and front end your messages in your abstract to a clear introduction as to what the problem actually is, and then your method. How do you address this problem, or how do you intend to address this problem? In the results section, you can explain that there's no results yet, or you're waiting for them, or you could talk about the fact that the expected results are X, Y, and Z, and give them a reason as to why in the discussion. And then we start moving on to the top tips. So this is not just guidance collected from publications, but also from my experience as well. These are some of the things that I would recommend, just to take forwards. Make sure you're using simple language and phrases. This needs to be accessible to all people from all backgrounds, whether they're a lay individual, which means that they have never worked in academia a dot in their life, to your academics that are, have been in the field that you're working in for numerous years. Be cohesive and adhere to the structure of the journal or the publication that you're trying to work within. It should be standalone. You should be able to take your abstract, print it out, and put it in a completely different building with completely different people, and they should be able to read your work and understand what the project is about and why you've done it and what your results are. Be interesting, balanced, honest, precise, unbiased, and concise. And it should never mislead or misrepresent any of the work that you have done. Remain consistent and keep it updated if you edit your work. So if you have reanalyzed your data and you found a slight difference in your statistics, go back to the abstract and revise that abstract because it needs to reflect the body of the work that it's trying to represent. We have some more tips. Use the full capacity of the word count. If there is a 350 word count limit and you have used 100 of those, you are not telling me that you've got enough to say to be present at the table when it comes to that research project. Use the full amount of the word count. Use your key messages clearly. Avoid non-standard abbreviations. So make sure that you are clarifying all of your abbreviations, and make sure that you do not use the passive voice if possible. So for example, patients weren't done on something. We actively put people here. We actively researched this. Make it that the team did the work and show that you were very engaged with the project. And finally, the author should be listing appropriate keywords relevant to support people finding your work. So if you're doing work around frailty that we've used before, make sure that you're using the word frailty. It may also include medicine for the elderly, but if it's in something else, add whatever that area is. Again, if it's for education, you want to look at medical education and go and make sure that you're using those keywords. That's everything from me today. I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions whatsoever, please do get in touch with us at the Beacon Academy using our email, which is contact@thebeaconacademy. There will be more workshops which you're welcome to join and get involved in or review in your own time, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you ever so much.